existing ICT-based initiatives to be optimized and use technology optimally to address concerns of equity. If one had to write a manifesto like this before and review it after the pandemic, I think you can see where are all the, the issues that get flagged. Teachers require suitable training and development to be effective online educators. Now this is something that hasn't changed. But there are changes required in pedagogy, especially in online assessment. Because how does one bring a test online? And how to blend this with experiential and activity-based learning. So the measures that were recommended was that we should have pilot studies. They were imagining that this would happen gradually, that it was necessary to augment digital infrastructure, to have online teaching platforms and tools. When they mentioned e-learning platforms such as Swayam Diksha, and none of us had realized that what would actually change things is Zoom, or how to have these Zoom classrooms, and it's a new word or a new usage of the same old word in our vocabulary. Right. The most important thing that the NEP had visualized was the development of content. And they somehow imagined that there was a repository that could be developed slowly with a public system for ratings by users on effectiveness and quality. Right? But they had also recognized that there was a digital divide, that a substantial section of our population has very limited digital access, and existing mass media needs to be used for telecast and broadcast. Now, this, they had not thought about TikTok or other such modes of communication, which is where most of the existing mass media is going. So the digital divide, it sort of exists in a very different way right now. Infrastructure needs to be augmented right now, and there is no real time for us to revise pedagogy and teacher training, because these are all requirements that have to constantly be sort of implemented if we are going to have online learning and teaching. As physics educators, although many of these are true for other disciplines as well, laboratories are a huge problem. And this is one of the things that we hope to discuss a little today, that when you have online education, there will be some component of online laboratories that we have to worry about. It's one thing to say that we have online teaching for students who are based not very far away, but if you're going to go into that mode, especially when when people look at MOOCs and stuff like that, you're listening to lectures given in Stanford or MIT or wherever. What do we do about experience and experiments? All right? So this is going to be necessary. Pedagogy and evaluation, I think there are subtle things at play over here, and I'll come back to that. One easy way out is to go for blended modes of learning. So some of your lectures are online, some of your lectures are offline, but this seriously impacts the access issue. If you have some lectures in person, then those people who are accessing your lectures from a distance, there's a differential over here. Now, as I said, there is not much time. You need to start doing some of these things immediately. More importantly, there is an opportunity here to revise things, and unfortunately my personal view is that post-pandemic, which we have all conveniently forgotten, we haven't used the advantages of resetting our system as best as we might have. And one of the important things, takeaways from the technology initiatives, is that really there is no option if you are going to have to reach all sections of society. I feel that we are losing opportunities by forgetting about the pandemic. All right. But there are challenges also over here. As all of us in this room who have taught and are teaching, we know that education is a community activity, and this is one of the few ways we know of reducing social inequality. Right? This requires discussion, this requires debate, this requires communication, interaction, all sorts of social contact. The online space is, as we have realized after these few years that we've spent on largely online existence, it reduces many of these things. The other part is that each subject has its own pedagogic dynamic. There are different ways of teaching different subjects, and sometimes we find it very difficult to teach. I find it difficult to even lecture without moving my hands. We do so much of our talking, our communicating by gestures, by smiles, by all sorts of facial expressions and so on. And the online space reduces us to entities on a screen, and it sort of diminishes us in some particular way. So the teaching of a subject changes, and people have talked about it, as we all realize it. But importantly, online education has simply not lived up to its potential, and this was apparent even before the pandemic set in. A fully online coursework contributes to socio-economic and racial achievement gaps. And this is written in America, so they're always worried about the cost of it. But what concerns me, and especially as you know, we sit in a very socially sensitive, and sort of with you in Hyderabad right now, which is is an extremely socially sensitive space over there. And we know that one of the things we want to do with education in general is to reduce these socioeconomic and substitute the word race by caste, and we've got exactly the kind of issues that we really do need to address. All right. What we found during the pandemic, and what you found and I found and all of us found together, is that interacting with each other and with their teachers digitally reduced the students, because for many students the smart device was a smartphone and not a laptop, and for a teacher it was a laptop. And even today that is true. Most students really use everything on their phones. I think that when you're teaching, we imagine that we are teaching another person of essentially the similar dimensions, and instead we are actually teaching somebody who's accessing us through a very small screen. And the consequence is that they're very poorly socialized. The students that are coming into the classroom today, I don't know what your experience is, but my experience at IIT Delhi is really that they are extremely poorly socialized. They don't know how to interact with each other, and there are serious issues of mental health. This may be a transitory phase, but it's one of the unintended outcomes of online education, and this is something for us to remember, especially when there are subjects that require interaction. We also realize that the digital divide in India is very real, and the economic divide is obvious. So only 8% of homes, and this is data that we collected in 2020, 8% of homes with students had reliable computer plus internet connections. There's a rural versus urban divide, there's a gender disparity, economic disparities, everything plays a role. So even though we've all had to use it, most of us are a little wary about online classes. So purely online classes are not feasible for any institution and for most subjects. There is a generation gap, but that's sort of reducing. I mean, there are many teachers of, regardless of age, who are quite happy on. I mean, the difference shows up. The students are on Instagram, the teachers are on Facebook, but you know, and the teachers are on Facebook and imagine that they are cool, which the students, of course, know. But I think that these are all gaps that can be crossed. All right. One of the things that I feel is changing with the online space is that we demand a little more from our students, and this may or may not be practical in our country, especially because of the social realities that we live with. But we have few options over here, right? Self-learning has to increase with, for our students. And while the NEP imagined that there's going to be this huge repository of online courses, that is still not being built up because there are some technical subjects, and physics has got, I mean, there are MOOCs, of course, but they are from third-party sources. A few days ago at the Academic Council of the university, which we are all familiar with, we actually approved courses to be taken for credit from a third-party vendor who is, based in unknown space. So we are willing to now trust the teaching of physics courses, and I'm concerned about that only, by people delivering instruction in different accents, with different paradigms, with different examples. This may be necessary for faculties where there is expertise is lacking, but this poses a challenge for all of us, and it increases a gap between students and teachers at a given institution. So this is something that we need to consider. So if you're going to teach online, you need to invest time. During the pandemic, Madhurima and I had thought that, since we are all in the same boat, let's share our ideas and whatever techniques we are employing. So we started something called the Discussion Forum for Online Teaching. And we were particularly concerned. We had panel discussions and we did all sorts of stuff. There's a link over there. Nevertheless, we addressed a lot of issues, including laboratory instruction. So there's been some attempt to move labs online. Venkatesh Chopela will talk about that later on today. Ahmedabad University has tried some things, IIT Bombay tried certain things. I know everybody who had to teach for over a year during the pandemic had to think about how to teach labs online. So there are simulations that work. Here's the double slit experiment that people, that students could try to do, in a virtual setting. How effective it is it's really not clear. And but what is not clear at all, even 2 years after after we've come back, is what is the effect of being trained in this way when you come back to the real world? That is, people make jokes about, surgeons who have been trained during the pandemic and how they come and they're just not able to perform surgeries. But that's even true for physics students, right? So if all your lab experiments were online, what kind of a student are you going to be in the laboratory? So, so many of these issues need to be debated about, and here is where the gender aspect starts becoming a little clearer. The online space is more inclusive. You can have larger classes because there's no limitation on desks and benches. The e-learner has to be very self-paced, and this could result in better learning. The anonymity of a classroom makes it easy, of an e-classroom makes it easier for some students to ask questions, and we've noticed that many more women communicate and ask questions in the e-classroom. Also students from other disadvantaged groups, right? And there is pressure to to move into an online space, because now we are told from the UGC that total online training is good for a degree, right? But we can't allow this is the fact that the legislation is coming around to how does this impact our teaching. And given the context of the conference and the workshop, I think it's important to consider the role of gender. Now, even looking at the room, one can see that at the teaching level, many STEM teachers, at the secondary and tertiary level are women. In particular, it is well known that many school teachers are women, also science school teachers, but also a lot of college teachers are women. And this is noticeable that as you go up the hierarchy, the number of women decreases, but the number of teachers, there's not as much of a gender gap. Also, the number of students is more or less equal at these levels. Disparity increases higher on. So a question that one has to ask is that if all your teaching is online, how effective is it in communicating the subject, and does it or does it not play a role in changing the gender gap in the next stage? So if your undergraduate teaching has been all online, what does this say for the gender gap at the postgraduate level? Does it increase the gender gap, or does it reduce it? That is not entirely clear, except in one tangential way. That tangential way is there was a workshop, as was pointed out by Shobhrati, that at ICWIP23 University, that asked the question, are multiple choice questions as a way of evaluating students, are these gendered? And what came out of that discussion is that extensive research across the world, and not just in India, show that the effect of online and the so-called anonymous exam, or supposedly gender-neutral settings such as examinations, using a format which you wouldn't have thought of as gendered, this can actually play a role, which means that we do really need to do research as to how these kinds of accessible spaces, where allegedly we feel that gender doesn't play a role, how that actually might be contributing in a very subtle way. Because the outcomes need to change if we are going to have to rely more and more on such methods of instruction. It's true that in what we discovered during the pandemic particularly is that women have poorer access to smart devices. They have poorer access to time, because within the home, they're accessing all these spaces from home, and at home they have effectively less time for study, typically multiple responsibilities, and so the digital classroom is not as gender neutral as one might want it to be. It is a gendered space. I've already mentioned the discussion forum for online teaching. There are a lot of resources out there that people might like to look at. And in particular, there's a book that we wrote based on our experiences. And this has, it addresses a lot of the challenges that going online poses for all disciplines, not just physics, but given the fact that both Madhurima and I are physicists, we had some kind of bias on inviting a lot of comment and commentary and worrying about how one teaches these subjects online. In today's conference and workshop, I think that many of these aspects will be talked about. I hope that they will. I would like also that, for us to be able to evolve some kind of a practice where we recognize the importance of gender and see how best to reduce the gap. And as Vandana was pointing out, we need to work towards a time when we will not have to talk about gender at all, right? So with that, let me thank you for your attention, and if there are any comments or questions, I'd be very happy to take them.
Any questions from the audience?
Good morning, sir. Vishwam, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, regarding this online teaching, most of the students nowadays are looking for ChatGPT. If you push any question, they're just typing on the ChatGPT, they're getting the answer. In the ChatGPT, that answer is correct or not. They're not at all reading any standard textbook. And also, the reference books, whatever the subject we're teaching, they're not enough in the online. Nowadays, students are not at all going to the library to read the standard textbooks.
Madhu, I am not actually able to, Vishwam, thank you for your question. I'm not entirely clear, so if I could just have put something in the chat box so that I understand what exactly is being said.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So he wants to know the use of ChatGPT. Like the students seem to be using ChatGPT, and what's the reliability of the answers that ChatGPT gives out. And two is that the reluctance of students to go to physical libraries. And if you do not have e-books available, what happens to referencing standard material?
Yeah. It's difficult to talk about how ChatGPT is going to change the landscape. It's going to change something about the way in which students answer questions. There is an illusion that we understand how some of these AI tools work. It's not clear to me that we actually understand what's going on. But in all these things, we are reduced to being consumers of these kinds of products. Right? And